Welcome back to another top 10 video. Today we'll be evaluating the relative importance of the impact of the most controversial domestic policies between 1850 and 1975.
Number 10, Black Codes. Black Codes were first instituted in southern states during 1865 and 1866. After the end of the American Civil War, to restrict the freedom of African Americans, southern states forced them into lower-paying labor-inducing jobs. The use of black codes was to ensure that slavery's name was gone, but not the practice. Laws that oppressed the African American community, like illegality of interracial marriage, not allowing African Americans to testify, and the creation of the Jim Crow laws, made sure that African Americans were still very much not free. The reasons why this was the first on the list was because of the normality of racism in society, and at the time, which did not surprise or create any resistance or protests from anyone. Number 9, Prohibition. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment, also known as Prohibition Act, made all forms of alcohol legal in the United States. This created a quick backlash from the people, as alcohol was very popular at the time because of the popular use in everyday society. During the lifespan of the 18th Amendment, the Great Depression was in progress. Many of the American population tried to look for alcohol as a way to forget about depression or just make it easier. However, they could not do so because of the restrictions. Large mafias took advantage of the 18th Amendment and looked to create illegal sales of alcohol as they did with many products. This gave the public another reason to ratify the amendment. The controversial part of the 18th Amendment was the amount of backlash it created right away, and not from any single group, but a large group of Americans. Number 8, Dawes Act. The Dawes Act was passed on February 8, 1887. The idea of the act was to create a more civilized environment by wearing more civilized clothes, sending kids to school, and owning property. This act would directly affect the Native Americans as their land was distributed among Native American families. This would create greater masses of reservations across America, which forced Native Americans to assimilate to American culture, which is greatly affecting their culture and traditions. As this may seem like a good act to in place, it overall greatly negatively affected the Native Americans as they were slowly losing their traditions. In long terms, these large reservations created more negative effects on the Native Americans as there were low amounts of opportunity and means to leave. The main controversial part about this act was the knowledge of the negative long-term effects that were not addressed at the time. The Dawes Act directly affected a single group in a very negative way that had long-term effects. The Dawes Act was a hammer that crushed any chance of Native Americans being able to grow out of the reservations, which made them stuck in a poor society, limiting their ability to achieve what an average white American could achieve. Number 7, Chinese Exclusion Act. In the spring of 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by Congress and signed by President Chester A. Arthur. The act enforced a suspension of Chinese immigrants trying to enter the U.S. and lasted till 1892, when it was renewed with the Geary Act. The idea for making the Chinese Exclusion Act was after many immigrants that had moved during the U.S. during the gold rush had started to grow in social class. As the Chinese became stronger, so did the anti-Chinese settlement movement. After the act was placed, there were many Chinese Americans who received large amounts of harassment and discrimination. The main reason why this act isn't higher on the list is because the group that was targeted was not as large as many other groups, like women during Roe v. Wade and the Indian Removal Act. Number 6, the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act was signed by President Andrew Jackson on May 28, 1830. This granted unsettled land west of Mississippi in exchange for Native American land that had existing border states. The Indian Removal Act was forced through the idea of manifest destiny, which was a forced colonization of America through the 19th century that was, no matter what, justified and inevitable. Many tribes would agree with these terms and give their land up, which would ensure them peace. However, many did not abide by these rules and would rebel against the act. The largest tribes that would rebel were specifically the Creek, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw. They, however, realized that they could not defeat the American armies and surrendered, leading to the Trail of Tears. The main reason why we put this act in the middle of the list is because it singly targeted a group and killed many Native Americans in the process.
Number 5. It's World War II. Japan attacked us, we enter, and we all hate the Japanese. Because of racism and the war, FDR signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. The order designated spots around the U.S. as military zones. By the way, it also made it so that they relocated tens of thousands of Japanese Americans into internment camps. Within the next 6 months after signing, 122,000 people were interned. All were stripped of everything. Everything from their homes were taken, including their homes, and citizenship was also taken. The U.S. lost so much money by taking everything from the people. This is why it was so controversial. This order led to other laws that affected Germans and Italians and other races involved. $1.3 billion were lost, but a total of $2.7 billion in net income was lost. People became really poor. This can be attributed to the internment camps in Germany, although not as harsh, still was race motivated. The camp themselves were pretty bad. No plumbing or cooking spaces. 25 people were crammed into rooms meant only for 4. The spread of disease like typhoid was rampant. Many cartoons of Japanese were made at this time, further dehumanizing them and furthering the internment camps. There was no compensation for decades and irreversible damage to 2 entire generations of Japanese American citizens. Number 4, the Dred Scott case. This started before the Civil War. Dred Scott was a slave whose master was taking him on a field trip all over the country, including the states where slavery was illegal, because of the Missouri Compromise and Northwest Ordinance. Dred Scott then sued his master, John Sanford, for his freedom. He first sued in the Missouri courts, but the court said no, and he should have sued while he was in the free states. It was then brought to the Supreme Courts, where it was argued for like a week, and then it took him a year to say no to Dred Scott. The decision was that blacks were stripped of citizenship, slaves and blacks could not sue in courts, and that Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Why it was so controversial? This literally made blacks not citizens. The Supreme Court decision basically made the slave versus anti-slave debates worse. The conflicts escalated, and the Civil War was pretty much inevitable. Basically caused a civil war. Well, the series of compromises before it did. But like this was the last straw for abolitionists. This also started and mobilized a century of Supreme Court cases after regarding race and the suppression of blacks. This diminished the status of blacks completely, further dehumanizing, giving more reason to fight for the freedom of blacks in the Civil War. This also helped gain Lincoln a platform and argument for his election. Number 3, Plessy versus Ferguson. It all started with Homer Plessy, a guy just trying to get on a train and just to be comfortable. However, since there was this separate car act and segregation happening in the South, they didn't let him onto the whites-only zone because he was an 8th black. Plessy told the lower courts this, and then it went to the Louisiana Supreme Court, where they said segregation was fine. This was decided by whites, obviously. Then Plessy appealed to the Supreme Court. It was decided on May 18th, 1896, that segregation for all public spaces was good and constitutional, even though it said that everyone is equal under the law. The U.S. took about 59 years to figure this out. So why it was so controversial? Like we said, white people thought it wasn't a violation of the Constitution, even though it clearly says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Basically, you can't make laws that worsens the lives of anyone, which is exactly what the South was doing. This also caused a third of a century of segregation, discrimination, and violence to people of color, on top of the 300 previous years of slavery. Literally, they were just freed. We also still see the effects of segregation today. Even though it may not be in the law, whites still try to separate races and suppress their rights. Even the dissenting opinion of John Marshall Harlan said that this decision was horrible and against the Constitution. Like if the head of the Supreme Court, who was white, born in Kentucky, says that this is bad, that's how you know America is doing something wrong. Number 2, Brown versus the Board. Here we have one of the most interesting cases and decisions ever made, because it is considered by historians the first case to challenge the Plessy versus Ferguson court decision. Oliver Brown, a poor black pastor in Topeka, Kansas, sued the Board of Education of Topeka for not letting his daughter into the all-white Sumner Elementary School that was closer to their house than the black school that was way too far. He was not alone. He was joined by 4 other cases, and this was then brought to the Supreme Court, which on May 17, 1954, decided that separate but equal was unconstitutional and that desegregation in schools should be carried out as soon as possible. Finally. Controversial? Of course. It was so controversial because it was the Supreme Court case that helped mobilize the civil rights, but also increased a lot of violence towards the civil rights. For example, Little Rock 9, so much resistance towards integration and the decision, but the government was the hero and stepped in and enforced the law. We see a lot of diversity in schools, and the graduation rates of minorities increases dramatically. We start seeing segregation around all the country in all aspects. Even though we see this, blacks and Hispanics still attend schools where there's a lot of black and Hispanics. Same for whites. Not only was freedom in schools, but in society as well. There's still a lot of work to be done, according to historians. Number 1, Roe v. Wade. Early 20th century, there was a lot of push for women's rights. 1960s, there was a lot of push for women's rights, but for opportunity in life, job, and equal stance in society. Norma McCorvey wanted to terminate her pregnancy, but she couldn't handle it because of financial reasons. She also did not want to have the baby. She couldn't get an abortion because it was only legal if the woman's life is in danger. Texas attorneys Lyndon Coffey and Sarah Weddington saw this and wanted to change the anti-abortion laws, so they filed a suit with McCorvey, and she became known as Jane Roe, against Henry Wade, district attorney of Dallas County, where they won legalization of abortion in Texas. But Wade was salty, so he continued to prosecute people and eventually appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the court was on Roe's side and decided on January 22nd, 1973, that abortion should be legal. Controversial? Yes. It's so relevant today. Some states are trying to ban abortion: Alabama, Missouri, and Georgia, and among many others that are continuing. You see a rise in anti-abortion movement, states trying to take down Roe v. Wade. Ever since the decision, there has been an attempt to remove the decision every single year. Goes against most religions, if not all. Looking at both sides, it is understandable from where they come from. There are good things from both sides, but it should definitely have a limit. People today use it to control women, but it actually should be used to help them. Thanks for watching.
Our video.
See you next time.